The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Policy and Practice webinar titled How to Future-Proof Your Council Tax Reduction Scheme for Universal Credit. It's great to see so many people join us today. Thank you very much for coming along. You're very welcome. And just while we get started, I am going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping just while we wait for some stragglers. First of all, if I could do a quick audio check with you, if I may. In the panel on the right-hand side, you should see the ability to raise your digital hand. So while I'm talking, if you could do that for me, please, just click the button to raise your hand, and that will tell me that you can hear us all correctly. Thank you very much. And while you're doing that, if I could just please say to ask questions throughout in the panel on the same panel on the right hand side, and do ask questions throughout the webinar. We will have a poll and a survey at the end, and we aim to have you on your way by 11:30. Thank you very much, everybody, for raising your hand. It's great to see that you can hear us. Thank you so much. So if I carry on now, what we can see then is a little bit about policy and practice. Just for anybody who's new to us, who's never known us before, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you here. Policy and practice exists to help make the welfare system simple to understand, so that people can make the decisions that are right for them. And we have a number of services that we do achieve that with. And one of the services we're talking about today is our council tax reduction scheme modelling. And today's agenda, we're going to be talking with, going to be joined by Paul Howarth, who's the director of the Welfare Reform Club. We're very delighted to have Paul with us, as indeed we are to have Ian Jones from London Borough of Hackney. Ian is Legislation Strategy and Policy Officer for Hackney. And indeed we have Zoe Charlesworth from Policy and Practice today. So you'll hear three other voices on today's webinar. And what we'll be talking about, today's agenda is, as you can see here on the screen, we're going to talk about the background to council tax reduction and trends since 2013, and Paul's going to take us through this, as well as the information about arrears and collection rates, and talking about objectives of CTR schemes. So then Paul will be handing over to Ian to talk about Hackney's experiences. And I'm sure you'll be very interested to hear some of the things that Ian has to say. And indeed, we're going to then be talking with Zoe about the need for change, which is driven by universal credit, and also a look at some of the different models that we have helped people to model, and looking at winners and losers of those different schemes as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Paul Howarth to talk about council tax reduction schemes. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, well, thank you, Janet, and good morning, everyone. I think, as Janet says, my role is to provide a bit of context and some policy background to council tax reduction schemes before we get on to looking at some of the options in more detail with Ian and Zoe. So let's start with a brief recap going back to 2013. If we have the next slide, please. And it seems amazing now that around this time 5 years ago, many of you listening in today would have been consulting about your very first council tax reduction scheme. And as you may remember, it was a bit of a rush, to say the least. You were given really very little time to have a scheme ready to go live by that April. And furthermore, there was a 10% cut in the budget, which you'll recall, which was designed to save about 410 million in England. And this was basically a cut that the government decided with no real policy rationale at all. It was just a straightforward contribution to reducing the budget deficit. But it meant real pressures, obviously, on local government. There was also the requirement to consult with the various authorities that you're associated with, but also, of course, the public, and to have a scheme ready for January before starting off in April. And then we have the DCLG with various policy constraints. As you know, there's a default scheme for the pensioners for pension age, which basically means that they continue to get CTB. And then the single person discount stays as it is. So the policy flexibility was limited. So it's not surprising, really, that most schemes mirrored council tax benefit. There was not really anything very radical, but that, of course, is was the nature of the beast at that time. So let's look at what happened since then. We'll go on to the next slide.
Okay.
And for this bit, I've referred to a research group called New Policy Institute, which you may have come across, because really they are the experts on various schemes and trends since 2013. All of this refers to the 326 authorities in England. So for the purposes of this, we're not talking about Wales and Scotland. They do have a very good, interesting website, which is www.counciltaxsupport, all one word, .org. So if you want to get more information, I would go there. They do tend to be a bit worried about the range of schemes in different areas, sort of postcode lottery type worries, which personally I don't think is that warranted. But anyway, that's their stance on this. But it's nevertheless, there is a fantastic range of information available. What it shows is that since 2013, 264 of those 326 authorities have included some form of percentage cut or minimum payment. So essentially, this was dealing with the 10% cut in budget that was imposed. So most of these will do that in advance of the assessment. So, instead of 100% of liability, we'll start off with 80% of the liability maximum and then go through the assessment. There are some authorities who do it the other way around. So you start with 100%, you go through the assessment, and then when you've got the assessment at the end, you then apply the percentage cut. But those, I think, are generally in the minority. And then, not surprisingly, 214 councils removed or reduced, but generally removed the second adult rebate, which it was not that well used anyway, and was one policy freedom that was good in that sense, in that it really sort of streamlined the scheme. And then 100 councils have introduced some form of band cap. And by that, what we're talking about here is where we've got the higher value properties, the amount of benefit that would have been received on those higher value properties was actually reduced to what you would have got in the lower value property. So essentially, you won't get more. The most common cap applied is band D. And you don't get any more than you would get if you were in band D. That's the principle, and 100 councils have introduced that. And then there's a range of perhaps smaller scale tinkering around the edges type options, which many authorities have introduced. And that is a reflection, incidentally, of the sort of policy freedom that local authorities now have in this field, which is something I've fought for some time, and I'm very pleased that that policy freedom is available to local authorities. There should be more, really, but anyway. You can see that 98 councils have lowered the maximum savings limit. Most of those have gone down to 6,000. Which is the most common, the threshold that now exists. That is the most common one. 58 councils introduced some sort of minimum entitlement. So, in other words, if your assessment comes down to less than £5 a week, then basically you don't get it. You have to have £5 to start with before you before you can get anything at all. Not the most popular one, but 58 councils have gone down that route. And then 25 councils have increased the income taper. So that, again, is a small savings measure, not particularly good for working centres, but is nevertheless something that some councils have decided to experiment with. So those are the sort of main trends. You can see this in a graph here, which again is taken from the New Policy Institute work. And you see at the top, I mean, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see the yellow is the current year, 2017-18, and the green is the original 2013-14. So at the top, those councils who have kept council tax benefit pretty much as it is, you'll see it started off fairly small, but it's actually got smaller still. So the green bar is fairly small, yellow bar even smaller. All the other measures, more councils have introduced these things as we've gone on through the 4 years. And particularly at the bottom there, you can see where most councils do have some sort of percentage cut. That has actually increased over the period since CTR came in. So that shows you the sort of trends in the graph. And then moving on to some of the policy issues and consequences. First of all, to briefly talk about council tax arrears. This is a pretty mixed picture, it seems to me. Looking at DCLG documents, as far as I understand it, the total amount of council tax arrears is something like 2.8 billion. And that, the latest figures show that has actually increased. So 2016-17, there's been an increase of 102 million over 2015-16. And there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence, Citizens Advice in particular, but other groups as well, that they're getting more and more referrals on council tax arrears. So that is obviously an indication of the problem. And groups like Step Change, who are dealing with the overall problems of debt, obviously report that council tax arrears is contributing to these overall problems. So that's an issue. And you can see this graph, which actually shows, you won't be able to read it, but it shows the change in council tax arrears between 2012-13 and 2015-16. And it's divided up into authorities who have retained CTB all the way up to those who have put in a cut of 20% or more. So what's happening here is that those who have retained or only marginally changed CTB have actually improved their arrears collection. As soon as you start introducing some form of cuts, then arrears start to develop and become very significant, or certainly more significant, 40 million or so in those authorities who have a minimum payment of more than 20%. So there is no doubt that council tax arrears have come about because of this policy, but it's the extent of it, the size of it, the scale of it that is at issue. So if we go on to talk about collection rates, which is obviously an allied subject to this, you can see from the next slide, again, DCLG figures showing overall no change in collection rates. And these again are England rates. And you can see that overall at top, 2012-13 collection rates were 97.4, and they're now 97.2. So, a fairly marginal change. And And it does appear, if you go down the sort of figures that are broken down, that the figures have fluctuated marginally, but have not really significantly changed. I mean, at the bottom, for example, Shire districts, 98.1 in 2012-13, gone down a bit, but now back to 98.1. Now, these figures might hide a multitude of things which you can talk about more eloquently than I can, but from just looking at these ball statistics, that it does seem that collection rates have held up reasonably well. There have been also quite a few reviews into the operation of the scheme, which I haven't really got a slide about, but just to mention the main one, Ollershaw in 2016, which called for more flexibility in the consultation arrangements and the way the schemes are introduced and changed, and in policy matters such as more control over a single person discount, if you like. So that alongside these developments, there have been various reviews which have come up with different recommendations as to the way forward. So if we move on to the next slide, I think we are now the poll territory. Yeah.
Indeed, yes, thank you, Paul. So yes, at this point we were going to serve a poll, asking you, and hopefully that should come up on your screen shortly, and give you the opportunity to tell us what would your main objective be if you were changing your CTR scheme. Hopefully you can see 5 options here. Please choose one of these options. So it's your primary objective, your main objective. Reduce the cost of the scheme, for example, the cost of the benefit stroke discount. Reduce the administrative costs for the authority. Reduce or avoid increasing council tax arrears and the cost of collection. Align with universal credit, or reduce poverty. I can see the responses coming in as I'm talking. Thank you very much. I'll give just a little bit more time to let you vote. And I know then that Paul, Zoe, Ian may have some comments on the answers, and indeed Paul's then going to carry on talking about objectives of council tax reduction schemes. So I'll just give you just a couple more seconds, and then I'll close the poll and share the answers with you. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to close the poll now, and then hopefully you should see on your screen how everybody's voted. Zoe, would you like to comment first?
Yeah, by a long way, the main objective seems to be to reduce admin costs, and I think this is just really sensible. You've got universal credit coming in. It's an opportunity to do this. And it actually reflects, we've been out visiting loads of local authorities to do CTRS impact assessments, and this always comes up. The amount the local authority gets towards admin costs, I think we worked out, was £11 per case, which once you start getting rid of housing benefit, the cost to the authority of doing a standalone CTR case is just going to be huge compared to the costs they're actually paying out. So yeah, this absolutely aligns with everything we thought, but I'll leave it to Paul. Paul's carrying on talking about this, so there's lots of different objectives there, but that's obviously the one that stands out easily.
Okay. Ian,
sorry, Jen, do you mind if I interrupt just for 2 seconds? Just to hear in Heckley, I mean, I just want to reiterate that's exactly in line with our initial thinking. But don't be surprised, and I'll allude to it when I come and do my bit, that these priorities will change over the course of time as other people become involved in the process.
Lovely, thank you, Ian. Paul, I'm going to hide this slide because I know now that you should be back on the main screen, and you have a slide to talk about yourself.
That's right. Well, that was very interesting. There was quite a range. I know it's a bit artificial because you're choosing one objective, and of course you will probably have several objectives. This slide really repeats the main options that you just voted on in the poll. but also includes one or two others like promote work incentives, which really is part of the universal credit story. In reducing poverty, you probably want to define who it is who in your authority you would say are vulnerable people, and try and protect them, perhaps even give them 100% rather than 80% or 75%, whatever it is. And you might also want to have a look at trying to simplify the scheme, which will actually align with the most favourite objective that you've just chosen, which is reduce administrative costs. So it is, I mean, all of these objectives are ones which we've seen in the work that we've done with authorities, that authorities want. Obviously, it's very difficult to marry all of these objectives up. You can't really have them all, I don't think. But when it comes down to it, choosing what your objectives are is really very important, because it's from then on that you can then do the modelling, which will give you options in line with your objectives. So just to move on to that bit on modelling. What we believe is really important here is to get as detailed account as you possibly can of each scheme that you might be interested in. And to do that, if we take your SHIBI data and then pass it through the Universal Benefit Calculator that Policy and Practice has developed, we can then give you, first of all, a clear understanding of what your current scheme does, however it's constructed, and that scheme rated to take account of any future council tax increases or other issues. And then also look in detail at any proposed schemes that you might want to model. So you'd be able to work out the costs in terms of the benefit, the costs in terms of, well, a rough estimate, I think, of what the admin costs might be. We have to make assumptions in that territory, really. And then the detailed impacts at household level. And what we have been able to do is show those impacts not only at household level, which is information that you can use when you get it back, but also in groups of households. So we can show the impacts by tenure, social, private renting, by economic status, whether people are in work or not, and by council tax band, for example. So, and indeed household status, which is quite important. What are the impacts on people who are single, couples with children, single parents, etc. So all of that can be provided, and of course we can then project that into the future to include the impacts of universal credit and the national living wage and tax allowances. So all of these things are important to know, really, in order to make your decisions about the future schemes. So I'm now going to hand over to Ian. I think that's the next. No, I'm not. I've got just one slide to finish off on, and that is some of the other considerations that you might want to take account of. Now, the financial pressures, it seems to me, are going to increase, and now that the funding for council tax reduction is part of the business rates retention scheme, then obviously it's going to be more important to make that work locally. Probably more important to get more people into work and to reduce the cost of the scheme, but also probably, as you've indicated, important to look at the administration costs as well. I don't think the policy for those over pension age is going to change very soon. I think we'll have to live with CTB for pensioners for some time. So I think it is, we're going to have the two schemes, whether we like it or not. So, I think the working age scheme could divert from that quite considerably. And maybe it is now the time. I mean, so most authorities have, understandably to some extent, introduced schemes which mirror CTB in many ways. Is it now time to think about ways in which we can move away from that? We could mirror universal credit, although that doesn't have to be mirroring every part of the universal credit policy agenda. Self-employed people, issues there, which we'll come on to, no doubt, and so on. But it's obviously important to have an eye to universal credit and to know what is going on there, because that is going on alongside it. There is no, I think my conclusion probably would be that there's no perfect scheme, but we perhaps ought to, and I'm indicating here, move towards, if we can, some sort of broad brush discount that would fit with reducing admin costs. It would almost certainly have to be backed up by some sort of discretionary hardship scheme, but you've got the authority to do that. So that seems potentially a way forward. So now I am going to hand over to Ian, who's been waiting patiently. And I hope that's a useful sort of introduction to where we are now. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, yes, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Still morning, isn't it? Yes, just about. My name's Ian Jones, and I work for London Borough Hackney. And I've been asked, if I can, just to give you a background of our decision-making process. When it came to the review of our council tax reduction scheme. A little bit of background to start off with. Our scheme is significantly the default scheme, with one significant difference is we have a 15% minimum contribution. That was introduced in April 2013, has remained unchanged since. And when I say unchanged, I do mean unchanged. We have not uprated applicable amounts. We've made no adjustments to the scheme whatsoever over the last 3-4 years. So it came to us a situation where, and Paul alluded to it earlier, about the increasing costs of the scheme to the council in comparison to the funding that we've received. And just to give you some idea, indication what that means, if we look only at the RSG funding that Hackney's received, if in effect our scheme costs us at this particular moment in time £25.5 million, and we receive funding from the RSG of 8.6, so that's a £16.9 million shortfall that we're having to fund from local government resources. And again, in the context overall, and again, this is something that all local authorities are obviously facing. Over the last few years, with a significant number of cuts, we have had cuts totaling to the council of £110 million. And another £29 million to be found by 2019. So in light of all that particular background noise, it's become increasingly clear that there was going to be a need to review and revisit our council tax benefit scheme, reduction scheme. But there was also going to be a need, obviously, because the other significant driver in this instance is the introduction of universal credit. Now, Hackney is lucky in that it's one of the last, lucky I suppose is the right term, yes, in that it is one of the last local authorities to go over to universal credit. We're not actually scheduled to go live for UC until June 2018. In that case, and that's given us an opportunity, to examine what's been going on those local authorities which have already gone live and the potential impact. But it's also given us a certain amount of breathing room, which has been particularly useful. Now, when I say that we haven't changed the scheme, that's not without the want of trying. Over the last 3 years, we have been asked by members who have had an eye on the increasing cost to the council or the schemes to review the scheme and asked us to have a look at what's going on. And at each and every case, there have been a number of hiccups and problems which have meant that we've never been able to effectively follow through on that particular request, either because the modelling that we've undertaken hasn't produced, we've not been confident in the information that we've been able to extract from our systems, or where we have had more confidence in the modelling that we've undertaken, there has been an external factor which has actually meant that we have run out of time to significantly, to think about significantly radically changing the council tax benefit scheme and going out to consultation. As you will be familiar with the best laid plans of mice and men. They tend to, we're on the vine in our case. In the last 3 years, we've obviously had a general election, a separate mayoral election, and a number of instances which have actually come out of left field and interrupted our carefully laid plans and timetables. Getting back to, having decided that last year in fact, that this year was going to have to be the time that we make a change because of the upcoming introduction of universal credit. We then discussed how we best would do that. And again, it was decided at that early stage, that we would want to engage an external consultant in assistance with the process. And that's really for 3 reasons. First of all, I mentioned that confidence in our own expertise and our own modelling. To a certain extent, the churn in officers, and certainly officers with specialists in these sort of analytical circumstances, has meant that we don't have the depth of knowledge that we once had. And therefore, it was agreed that actually, if we wanted to be absolutely and totally confident in the modelling that was going to be done, we'd like an external consultant to do that, at least to verify and back up our early conclusions. Secondly, obviously with the UC rollout, we wanted to take advantage that we could learn from what was happening in other local authorities, and the best way to get that would be the consultant to examine what's going on in local authorities and make a recommendation on how we adjust that accordingly. And the third, and probably the most relevant for us in Hackney, was the question of member confidence. Now, again, I mentioned that this is not the first time we've visited the changes to a council tax benefit scheme. I can tell you that in effect, the problem is not so much that members aren't keen on changes, they're just not keen on the same change. We have a significant situation where over the course of the last 2 sessions, we've been asked in various stages to model 38 different versions of a council tax benefit scheme, because members are looking to make adjustments in respect to the external circumstances and external drivers. For us, the key at the moment has always been, and always has been, from an officer's perspective, is what the lead members have been driving for. And that, as I meant, from the outset in this case, has been looking to redress the balance between the cost of the scheme and the funding that we receive. So effectively, we're going to have to try and bring down the cost of the scheme for Hackney in order to, get some sort of redress and to recognise that there has been a significant cut in funding. Now, we asked Policy and Practice to come in and engage with us on that, and not only were they able to, we initially asked them to undertake 4 modelling scenarios, which ranged from an increase in the contribution from 17% right up to 25%. That was initially our initial request for them. Having done that, we put that to members, and certainly to the lead members. And again, even then, under those circumstances, despite the confidence of having an external provider, producing those figures for them, they still were after some additional information. So we asked Policy Practice to do another 5 models, ended up 9 in all. And again, after some to and fro and some discussions, we finally settled on a scheme which has looking to increase the contribution from 15 to 20%. It brings what it also does is bring all the applicable amounts and other changes in the scheme up to date. So effectively, it now reflects local costs and up-to-date costs. And finally, it now changes from a situation where a universal credit scheme or universal credit is now counted as an income, and I won't go into the details of what that actually means in terms of the assessment process, but effectively, those modelling, that modelling has been particularly useful for us in trying to explain to members the impact, which brings me on to the next point I really wanted to make about impact. Well, again, when we say we lacked confidence in our modelling, it wasn't that we lacked confidence in the ability to crunch the numbers and come up with the big figures. The issue is that you can talk strategically to members and say the scheme will now cost us, a saving of, we'll be able to generate a saving of 2.1, 2.4, whatever million pounds. The question that always comes back is, well, what does that mean to applicants? What does that mean to those in receipt of benefit? If I give you a particular scenario, what it is? And that's much more difficult actually to demonstrate on a wider scale, because it actually encompasses a much wider remit than just what is the change to the council tax benefit limit. And what we get from policy and practice, or have from this modelling, is a certain amount of confidence that they've been able to introduce or they've been able to reflect in their modelling external variables, which helps us actually impart that communication. And that really largely is what I wanted to sort of get over. I just wondered if there's any questions or anybody's got any information or needs any more information.
Ian, thank you so much. I think we've got, we may have a couple of questions coming through. I'm sure people will reflect a lot on your experiences in Hackney. I think what I might do is to keep the questions to the end. If we want to move over to Zoe now and then come back to the questions at the end, Ian, if that's okay.
That's fine, yeah, no problem.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Janet. Yes, I'm hoping to, in this little end session, cover some of the schemes that we've modelled for people looking forward to universal credit. And we're going sort of down into the nitty-gritty, looking at winners and losers of certain schemes. I'm only looking at the most radical changes, the ones that people are looking at to sort of fit in with universal credit. And we're only covering an overview. As Ian mentioned, what we tend to do when we do modelling is look at the impact on various cohorts of your population. So, for example, how would this affect a single parent? How would this affect social rented tenants? But we're not going to cover that in this because it will differ so much between authorities. What I'd like to say at the beginning is the rollout of universal credit is a really good opportunity to introduce a new scheme, perhaps a more radical scheme, but also in a gradual manner. We've worked with numerous local authorities, and I can count on one hand the ones who are going for the big bang approach, that everybody's moving over to a new scheme. The majority of local authorities are looking at introducing a scheme that fits with universal credit just for those who move over to universal credit and running their legacy system alongside it. The other advantage of making a change when universal credit comes in is that you actually have another agency doing an assessment of needs and assessment of income. And you can use this. It means that all this assessment can be stopped at the council. You don't have to do this. You can use the universal credit assessment. There are advantages and disadvantages of doing that. Obviously, you might want to do that partially and then introduce certain mitigating measures, as Paul mentioned. I know there was a difficulty in getting the information you required from Universal Credit, and had a recent meeting in Northern Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive are looking at this for the whole of Northern Ireland. And they were in discussions with DWP about getting the information they required so that this didn't have to come from the claimants. And I think they might have joined us today, and if so, it'd be good to hear from them after this about how their discussions on that are going. The other advantage is you can use your CTR scheme to support or mitigate the impact of universal credit, depending on your local objectives. Obviously, alongside advantages, there's challenges, and the monthly reassessment is one we hear over and over again, that if universal credit is changing monthly, which it will for many people, how do we ensure that we're not having to do reassessments monthly of CTR? And authorities are coming up with various responses to this. First of all, a de minimis change, that we're not looking at anything that changes less than a certain amount. Others are looking at set assessment periods, which I believe is the way that Northern Ireland's going. And others are, if you're going to the more radical options of discount schemes and banded discount schemes, you actually only need to flag those whose income is changing across those bands. And another challenge is obviously having the perceived fairness of having two systems side by side, that if somebody on legacy benefit is getting more council tax support or less council tax support than somebody on universal credit, that might be politically difficult. Can we move to the next slide, Janet? Right, so the simple solution for everyone is to keep the default scheme. As you move to universal credit, keep the default scheme, and you're probably all aware of what this is. The UC max replaces the applicable amount, and if we look at the income side, it's income that's used for UC purposes, plus your universal credit, and there's no earnings disregards. And we model this for a lot of authorities, actually, to see the impact, because if they're considering keeping the default scheme with their minimum payments that they currently use, or other individual local circumstances, the general outcome is that this will usually cost less than keeping, once people are on universal credit, your scheme will probably cost less than under legacy benefits. How much that changes will depend on the demographics of your area. Obviously, for households not in work, there's likely to be no difference in support. And for many households that are in work, because they're keeping 37p in the pound, they will receive lower CTR, but they will be having higher UC. And in the end, this is good news for local authorities, because it means support for those people is coming more from central government than from the local authority. But obviously there's a downside. Sorry, Janet, can we have the next slide? Yeah, keeping the current scheme doesn't keep everything the same. It doesn't mean that people's CTR won't change. I think a lot of people think, actually, if we keep the default scheme nice and easy, nobody's going to be really hit. That's not the case, because the assessment is different. If you've got people with needs element, i.e. what used to be the applicable amount, lower under UC than under legacy benefits, it also reduces the income side. And what that means is that they lose on the universal credit, but they also lose CTR. So they're doubly hit. You also have problems where income's taken into account is higher under universal credit than legacy benefits, such as the self-employed. So if we move on and have a quick look at the winners and losers of keeping the default scheme. The biggest losers are going to be the self-employed, working households containing a person with a disability, and working households in receipt of ESA support. And this is because of the end of the disability premiums. And obviously with the self-employed, it's a minimum income floor. We had tried to have a look for people who would gain both, have higher UC than legacy benefits and higher CTR. And I only came up with one group, I'm afraid. I'm sure there are others there. And that was people where income under universal credit is ignored, that was taken into account from legacy benefits. And the only one I could come up with was income from borders. So, I mean, this just illustrates that the default scheme is not just keeping everything the same. You will have groups who are hard hit. And if you're moving forward with the default scheme, you might want to know how many those are to see if you can do anything to support them. Yeah, next slide, Janet. So the advantages of keeping the default scheme, and there are quite a few, is apart from the fact that funding is, some of the funding is coming from central rather than from the local government. There's a taper rate, so there's a gradual withdrawal of benefit. The assessment process is known to your staff. And we mustn't underestimate this. You've already got a document drawn up and you just need to amend for your local circumstances. It can actually take a long time for your legal services departments to draw up new schemes. The disadvantages we've covered, some groups lose out. The monthly change in universal credit could lead to a high volume of reassessments, and I think this is really exercising minds. the admin cost savings, which we saw was a high priority, won't be made. Your admin costs will be much the same. And anyone who's worked in this field for a long time knows it's a difficult scheme to explain to the public. So let's have a look at some of the more radical options that local authorities that we're working with are considering. First of all, the banded scheme. This has been discussed for a long time. We've done a lot of models on banded schemes, and it's very hard to not make the biggest losers those with the highest needs. For those who don't know, sorry, I should have said, the banded scheme is where you look at all the income of somebody, of a household, and then discounts are applied to certain bands of income. So let's say between 200 and 250 a week, they get a 20% discount. 250s to 300, they get a smaller discount. You will always hit those with higher needs because there's no needs assessment in this. You're not looking at what people's requirements are. So, and the example I've got here is a one-person household with £250 a week may be fine. A four-person household with the same income isn't. So your losers are going to be those with high needs, and your winners are going to be the single-person households. Next slide. Thanks, Janet. So the advantages of this banded scheme is it's very easy to explain to people. It appears fair. If you're going to consultation, as people's income goes up, the discount gets less. And it's very flexible. You can change those bands and you can change the discounts very easily. The disadvantages is admin savings. The reassessments are still going to be needed as income crosses bands, not as much as if you've got a taper scheme. And the effect on vulnerable groups might not be politically acceptable. Authorities that have taken forward banded schemes have often introduced loads of mitigating measures for vulnerable groups, either discretionary support, or they've changed bands for vulnerable groups or put vulnerable groups in certain bands. The problem with this is you'll then end up with a scheme that's as difficult to administer as the current one. So the more sort of mitigating measures you put in, you're making your scheme more and more difficult, well, complex to administer. Move on to the next one. The next scheme I'd like to look at is a discount scheme, and Paul alluded to this. This is as simple as you can go, where a discount is given to all claimants who are on universal credit. And the biggest losers on this will be those on out of work benefits, because local authorities are trying to maintain costs very similar to if they maintain the current scheme. So if you're going to be putting a discount in, it's going to have to be a higher minimum payment. Out of work benefit people, if they're the people with large arrears, you might not want to go down this route. The winners will obviously be working households. Most of those will be better off. And because of that, this supports work incentives. If we can move on, it's an easy to explain scheme. The admin savings will usually be very, very large. You've got no assessment. It's a pure application of a discount. And you'll only require reassessment if you see ends or starts. What we have found on the modelling of this is that discount schemes do tend to offer protection to those who are worse off under universal credit. So if you have an anti-poverty strategy that is trying to mitigate the worst effects of universal credit, the discount schemes tend to do that. The people with disabilities and the self-employed are often very much supported. Anybody earning who falls in those groups will be supported by a discount scheme. There are disadvantages in that it might be perceived as unfair. If you're offering the same discount to lots of people on different incomes, and you'll also need an income cut-off to contain claimant numbers. We've got to remember that universal credit covers tax credits as well as the old out-of-work benefits. And if support is given to everybody on universal credit, you'll end up with increased claimant numbers. It's very easy to work out your income cut-off based on a Band D property and where support would have ended under your current scheme. Very easy to work out that income cut-off that you would need to apply if you introduced a discount scheme. Yeah, I'll go on to the next one. The final one is, this is the most popular that local authorities are looking at the moment, and this is a banded discount scheme. And this tends to cover the It's a mixture of the previous two. It's sort of a mixture of a banded scheme and a discount scheme. And local authorities are looking at this, having sort of two bands. So one discount for people on universal credit, a different discount for people with income above the universal credit, still on universal credit, but with income above. And obviously the only people who are on universal credit with income above universal credit will be earners who are keeping that 37p in the pound. But with this, you've still got that same problem that we looked at with discount schemes, is that if you're trying to contain costs, you might have to increase the minimum payment for the people on out of work benefits. And the winners are working households. So again, it supports work incentives. Next slide, thanks, Janet. Same advantages and disadvantages, more or less, that we saw with the discount scheme. There will be a need for reassessment, but it's a very easy message to get across to claimants. You'll only need to do a reassessment if someone goes in or out of work or is getting close to that income cutoff. And again, this scheme tends to support those who are hit by universal credit. Next slide, thanks, Janet. And finally, just before I hand back to finish, is that I'd just like to reiterate the universal credit. Under universal credit, if you're keeping the default scheme, even with local minimal payments or certain changes because of local schemes, it won't be neutral. There will be people who are worse off under the default scheme. And it's very, very tricky to actually give any more than an overview, because the one thing our modelling has shown us is that the local situation really does decide what is the best scheme. That for some, if you're in an authority where a group is hard hit, but there's only a handful of that type of household, you can set up a discretionary scheme and target support. If it's a large group of your population that are going to have a sudden drop in support, you might want to consider something else. So we really need to take into account the demographics of the local area and the starting point and the scheme that the local authority has now. If you're moving schemes, in fact, you don't want people to have a sudden big change in their CTR support. People get used to how much they're paying. So the current scheme you've got will be a good starting point to look at the change in support to different household types. Ian has discussed the importance of the views of members and their interaction on scheme change, and that impacts it a lot. And that comes down to the overarching policies and local priorities. Some local authorities are very strongly support certain vulnerable groups, and that has to be taken into account. So certain schemes that might suit one local authority won't suit others. And we can only ever work out if this will meet the objectives if you do through an impact analysis looking at different household types. So that if you have an anti-poverty strategy that's focused particularly on children, let's say, we can say that this will be the impact on those groups. I think that's all I've got to say. I'm sorry that's such an overview of these schemes, but we can't go into real detail because it actually does depend on the local authority. But that's just to give you an idea of what we've been finding.
Zoe, thank you very much. I think it's very interesting, as you say, you know, to get the overview, and one size definitely does not fit all. So very useful to hear what you have told us about the schemes. What I'm going to go to now, I have some questions that have come through, and I would just like to ask them of our various panelists. So I've opened the mics to everybody and to our panelists, and I've got some questions. So please do jump in and answer these questions that have come through. Thank you very much, everybody. We're doing well on time, actually. So please do feel free to pop more questions into the panel on the right-hand side. I'm sure from what you've heard today from Paul and Ian and Zoe, you must have lots of things to ask. But I'll kick off, if I may, with a question for Ian, if I may. At what stage, Ian, in the process Did you do your impact analysis, or would you say that the council did your impact analysis?
Effectively, I mean, again, it's our impact analysis is actually threefold in effect. The impact analysis is one, as alluded to, it's driven by members. They want to see what is the direct consequence of any changes that you propose. So effectively, when we were doing the narrowing down, as I say, the initial four modelling models that we identified, then supplemented by a further 5, were as a consequence of that initial impact assessment and the information we were getting back from policy and practice, and as part of the the modelling outcomes. So there's a certain amount of tweaking, and again, the background driver of that. Now, having then, as lead members, having selected a primary scheme they wanted to promote and take forward for consultation, then we did a formal impact assessment and a formal EIA based on the information we had, and both of which will need to be amended once we get the information back from the consultation process itself. Consultation is currently ongoing. So to a certain extent, I mean, it's a work in progress. I know that's probably not very useful information, but I can't argue it any other way than say that we do need to be relatively nimble and on your toes when you're modelling a scheme like this and taking them backwards and forwards to members, and you can expect them to want to see a number of adjustments or have a number of queries regarding what will be the outcome for the local community.
Thank you very much, Ian. Also, another question is probably related. It may not well be, but I'll ask you anyway. How many schemes? You talked about a big number of schemes that you modelled at Hackney, didn't you?
Yes. I would try and put this in context. 2 years ago, when there was a big drive locally to respond to the level of local government cuts, and the decision was made by the lead members of all departments that each scheme would need to be reiterated to make sure that there are no additional costs. We did some modelling based on that. When they saw the numbers that came out of that in regards to the potential impact on the community, we were inundated by different requests from different parts of the council, from different members, from different groups. Ended up at, over the course of the next 6 months, we did 38 different models, which is a ludicrous number to end up modelling. And we ended up largely having a very difficult and prolonged conversation with the cabinet about whether there was actually any time now to push forward on any of these options, as a consequence of the prevarication and the procrastination that comes out. Because effectively, for members, this is probably one of the more difficult decisions they have. It is clearly it's one that's while they can certainly blame local government cuts for any changes to a scheme. It's effectively the bottom line is who pays comes down to them.
So
they will have an input and a view.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that I think that Ian's case is pretty typical of actually having to tweak schemes at the end. But I would say most places would have 3 or 4, but they usually will, until you see the impact of a scheme on certain groups of the population. In advance, you can't, although you might have spoken to your local neighbouring authority or looked at something like this where we've discussed the winners and losers, until those the impacts on certain groups are put before members and put before the public, even in consultation, you've got real problems of actually understanding how it's going to hit your local population. So what we're finding with a lot of local authorities is they're asking for modelling of perhaps 2 or 3 different ideas, but they're holding some modelling back. So they get the impact assessment, get the reaction to that, and then maybe tweak the schemes and do a final model that they can then go out to consultation on.
Yeah. That's exactly the point. Sorry, I think again, the problem is again if as I say, our problem of not having engaged a consultant previously was that we had to model every suggestion, whereas we were able to, by dint of using policy and practice, to say actually, they have they have an opinion you should listen to.
Thank you, Ian. We shall. It's great to hear. Thank you so much. I have a question here. So forgive me if you feel that you've already answered this or explored this in enough depth. But Zoe, I'll give this one to you if I may. Does an impact analysis provide the information required for an equalities assessment and for consultation?
For consultation, generally, yes. And we've actually been involved with some local authorities in preparing information for consultation. We've broken the impact assessments we provide tend to break down by the sort of cohorts that you would require for consultation. Equalities impact, we can only go as far as the SHEBI and the CTR data allow. So we can give you by household composition, certainly, and there's various others by gender and certain impacts. Other impacts we don't have in the SHEBI data, but it can at least save the local authorities some time in that some of the groups that they need to look at for their equalities impact assessment will be covered.
Great, Zoe, thank you. I'm very mindful of time, and I did promise to get everybody on their way by 11:30, and we're a tiny bit over time. So apologies if you've sent a question in and I haven't given it to the panelists. What I will do is I'll get answers to you after the webinar, if that's okay. Now, what I'd like to do before moving on to the summary and the next steps, Zoe, Paul, Ian, just one final word from you, if you have something to say to finish up the webinar. Paul.
Zoe, for you first.
I'll leave this to you and Paul.
Okay. To be honest, I mean, again, if anyone's got any questions or any concerns or any queries about the bizarre way that Hackney appears to have gone about this process, by all means, do please email me, ian.jones@hackney.gov.uk, and I'm more than happy to give you some of the inside drifting information. But again, I mean, I think the only thing I can really say is be surprised about nothing when it comes back, and what you think you understand your members to be concerned about doesn't necessarily follow through when it comes to actually putting this into practice.
Thank you.
My final word is one of the things that I mentioned before about what local authorities have now got is the policy freedom in this area, at least. It could be more, but there is policy freedom, and that is something that we should use, I think. There are all sorts of options that you can look at. They will probably boil down to sort of variations on several themes in the end. But there is the opportunity here to get a wealth of information that will allow you and your members to make those decisions. So, I would really encourage you to think carefully about how you develop your scheme going forward.
Thank you, Paul. Great, thank you very much. So that leads me now to wrap up and move on to the next step. So those eagle eyes among you may have seen in the panel on the right, that famous panel on the right hand side, there is a section there called handouts, and you can download a leaflet there about the CTRS modelling service that we offer to local authorities. So I'd urge you to take a look at that. And also, if I can say, at the end of the webinar, there will automatically be a very short survey, 4 questions, can't really get much shorter. We do really value your feedback. We love our webinars, but we love it if you love them more. So do please give us your feedback. And also, as Ian said, there is the opportunity also to ask further questions from any of our panelists today. You can have the opportunity to request a sample of a paper copy of a CTR report that we have done for one council. There is a big, I suppose, proviso on that throughout the webinar, Ian and Zoe have talked about the work is bespoke and it's very defined to each individual client that we work with. So it is only a sample. Whatever you may have, your own priorities would be very different. But if you're interested in seeing that report, and it is fully anonymised as well, so you won't know who the client is, but it gives you an indication of the kind of information that we can give to you. And also you have the opportunity to request a call for us to talk through with you your own modelling options for your own schemes. So thank you very much, everybody. Without further ado, I haven't gone too much over time. I would just like to say thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope you've appreciated and enjoyed the information that you've heard, and look forward to seeing you again on another Policy and Practice webinar. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.